What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 50, and I am the host, Kyle Anzalone. Just a reminder, everyone, not going to do a show Friday this week because it's Christmas, so I'm spending a little bit more time with family, and I'll be back with shows on Monday. On today's show, I'm talking about the Christmas gift that Congress is pretending like they gave us with this COVID and spending bill authorizing about $2.3 trillion in spending. Again, most of it probably going to those connected in Washington, but they're making a really big deal out of the $600 check that they're going to send every American. So I'm going to go through and break down that bill. There's other big news, and that is Trump announced, I believe, 15 pardons of various people, ranging from war criminals to corrupt congressmen to people who were legitimately entrapped and deserve pardons. I haven't had time to go through all the names on that list and get like a good breakdown. Like I could do like a George Papadopoulos. He's one of the guys that I think deserved the pardon. But I know he also pardoned some of the Blackwater guys who killed the innocent people, unarmed people in Fallujah during the Iraq occupation. And so I don't know as many details about that. So I'm going to try to get that a breakdown on that on Monday's show. But main thing for today's show will be this COVID spending bill, which is absolutely crazy. I have like 2 pages worth of notes here, and I'm sure that doesn't even begin to skim the surface of ridiculous spending in this bill. So other than saying share the show, and if you could subscribe to the YouTube page, go to the libertarianinstitute.org and check out my work there. Now let's get into it. Okay, so this article I have here is from the Gray Zone, and so far it's the best breakdown that I have read on the spending bill, and they particularly go through and look at the like kind of regime change. The article is titled "COVID-19 Catch-22: Regime Change Policies Compat with U.S. Pandemic Relief." This is by Alexander Rubinstein and Jeb Sprague. So I guess just a couple more details on the bill before we dive into like some of the actual details here. Is it's actually two things going on, because depending on what where you're reading it, some people make it sound like there's a 2.3 $1 trillion spending bill. Some people are making it sound like there's a $2.3 trillion COVID relief bill. When what happened is Congress packaged the $900 billion COVID relief bill with the $1.4 trillion omnibus spending bill that approves discretionary spending in the U.S. And this is something I think they pass usually annually, but I don't think they have set dates on that. This is the bill they need to keep government funded. In total, this bill is 5,593 pages. There's a great tweet from I believe it was Young Americans for Liberty I saw it with, where they have this thing on like a library book card almost, like it's a massive amount of paper. They only had a few hours to read it before it came to a vote. And this was brought up from people, on different sides of the political aisle. I mean, you had Thomas Massey, Justin Amash, so that's a Republican, Libertarian. Tulsi Gabbard is a Democrat. AOC, Rand Paul, everybody is saying like, hey, this is ridiculous. You can't pass a 5,000 plus page bill before people have had a chance to look at it. One of the reasons is Americans and oversight groups and stuff need to be able to go through these bills with a fine tip comb, so we could argue that like, hey, this is just corruption, this is cronyism, this is a regime change policy, and start to unpack what should actually be stuff the U.S. government is spending money on and what is just being stolen from the American taxpayers. This bill passed the House 359 to 53. AOC, after complaining about not having enough time to read it, voted for it, which is unbelievable. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? The margins are what they are, but the lack of principle from that woman is constantly surprising. And then in the Senate, it was 92 to 6. Let's see. So again, you have the two different kind of bills here, and with the actual COVID bill, the 900 billion, Americans are going to receive $600 checks. I believe this is just Americans who file taxes and not like I don't think children are going to get this money, but I could be wrong about that. It's a huge bill, and I was trying to figure out, and I couldn't get an answer to that, as well as a couple other questions that I'll bring up as I go through here. So that would roughly total $180 billion to $200 billion, depending on what the administrative costs are to cutting all these chats and like figuring out where to enter numbers on the computer screens. And I'm sure that's going to cost some amount of money. So let's say that about 200 billion of this is going to go towards direct payments to Americans, which is interesting because it's a $900 billion bill. That leaves an awful lot of money. And it also means, because remember, when government spends money, they're either getting it through borrowing or taxing. And it seems like most of this money is going to come from borrowing. So this is going to increase the debt on the head of every American by, I believe, like $4,000 to $5,000. And so for us Americans right now, I think one of the ways we should look at this as, would we take out a loan today where we're going to get like about $600, but then we're going to take on $4,000 maybe worth of debt. Now it's a little complicated because some people are older and they'll never really have to worry about that debt, and I'm sure that however they are able to do things at the Fed, it's not going to be that Americans literally ever receive a bill for $4,000. However, you are going to lose, I think, that general amount in wealth over time, either through like the devaluing of money, higher taxes, or, even how things work now, where the more money the Fed lends out, and buys debt, other countries buy debt, the more, influence that they have, and the less the dollar's worth. And so that, hurts purchasing power. I gotta get like a real economist it kind of explains some of these points better when it comes to the actual what happens when the government decides to spend and print trillions of dollars, because it's going to have a lot of unintended consequences. And unless you could, see economics from somebody who like studies it all the time, then it's kind of hard to all keep up on. So maybe I'll try to get somebody on the show next week to look more into some of this spending angle. The rest of the money, they say, are for business bailouts, and I honestly haven't found like a good article that goes through it, and I haven't had the time to, sit through and read the 5,000 pages of this bill, nor likely will I. I mean, it's just an absurd amount of content to cover, but I'm not sure where that money is going. I've heard maybe the airlines are getting some money, some of it's going to small businesses. So certainly, some people are going to get some more money here, and not all this $700 billion is just a direct payoff to the people who are well connected with Congress. But if you look at the people who did the best off of the previous COVID bailout bill, it's generally the people well connected with the Congress, well connected with the Pentagon, the military industrial complex. So I think we'll see that again, but I'll continue to bring it up on the show as though those numbers are reported. Now, I believe that most of the spending I'm going to talk about now is more a part of the $1.4 trillion omnibus spending bill rather than the COVID bailout bill. However, it's, all lumped into this, again, 2.4 trillion dollar package, whatever it is. All right. So, and then most of the information I have here is from this article at the Gray Zone that I'll scroll through as I start to break down some of these numbers. $2.4 billion in there went to what they call democracy programs, and then there's 6.1 billion in foreign military financing programs, and 112 million for international military and training. And so these are all regime change type programs or regime support programs. So maybe this money is going to train a military where we, like the dictator government, are going to buy him some new weapons. So think of like Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, whichever government Biden's going to happen to support in Libya, or what they call the legitimate government of Yemen. They are very supportive of the government in Bahrain and Kuwait. And so I think we could see some of this money, kind of flowing to those countries. And then some of this is going to go towards like regime change operations. So anything to work against Assad consolidating his rule in Syria, anything to work against the government of Iran, anything to work against the Shia factions that are more sympathetic or backed by Iran and Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the government Biden decides not to like in Libya. I think, these are all those cases. Sudan and South Sudan, I'm guessing, will probably be recipients of this as well. Let's see. Now there's $6 billion more for Air Force missiles and weapons for the Navy. So, this is buying weapons here at home, not foreign spending. However, why are we buying more missiles for the Air Force? I think if Americans had to pick right now, with the number of people that are struggling, that they would probably want to open businesses first. But another thing on the top of the list would be, some kind of support for Americans within the U.S. and, not on more missiles that, Americans don't think we're really at war at this point anyways. The fact that we're dropping all these bombs and missiles would probably surprise a lot of people, and spending billions of dollars on it probably seems unneeded. So I think while it's a lot easier to like make the America First type arguments when it comes to these other programs that are foreign spending, I think it's still pretty easy to make the argument to Americans right now that either with the amount of total debt that the nation has taken on this year, that it's either better to save that money and to be prudent with it, and maybe you can't go out and buy like nice new fancy missiles and toys at this point, or it needs to go to welfare here in the US. I think it's pretty easy to make the argument that the money should be going somewhere other than defense right now. And it seems Republicans, especially those that are more sympathetic to like the Trump American First message, are pretty on board with that from what I'm seeing on Twitter. And this $6 billion in spending is in addition to the NDAA that was $740 billion, the huge Pentagon budget that they passed just, I believe, last week. All right, next up we have $300 million for countering China's influence. My guess is that this will go to ads, journalists that the U.S. likes, basically anything that people who will say bad things about the CCP, groups that will write reports about what's happening in the Uyghur communities in China, anything to make the Chinese government look bad. $3 million for the National Endowment for Democracy funds in Hong Kong. This is widely known as the U.S. like kind of regime change organization that goes around the world and tries to drum up opposition to the government in different ways. And so, we've seen this from Ukraine. We recently reported on it and happening in Hong Kong. And so, more money to that. $8 million for various NGOs. And this has to do with Tibet, where, again, it's a place where the U.S. could try to destabilize or undermine the Chinese regime by producing negative reports about them and fueling dissent within China. And not that the Chinese government isn't heavy-handed in all these regions. I don't want to make it sound that way. There's certainly certainly Tibet, like the people there have been oppressed, and China has kind of conquered what was an independent kingdom there and taken it over. And so it's not that that should be supported. It's just the U.S. spending millions of dollars to undermine it is not. First of all, it's not about the people of Tibet. If the U.S. wanted to support the regime in China, they would gladly, give the Chinese government weapons that would help oppress the people of Tibet. I mean, look how the U.S. has taken stands in the past on places like India and now Morocco with the Western Sahara and the occupation there. Israel, another great example of that. The U.S. It's just about geopolitics, and so we'll support them until we don't. And this meddling in other affairs is what needs to ultimately be changed. All right, 6 million for India and Nepal to support the Tibetan community there, and then 3 million to support the Tibetan government in exile. There's also, I believe, provisions in the bill that take a stand on, Dalai Lama reincarnation. I really don't understand how all of that is important. I know that it has to do with the Dalai Lama being the spiritual leader of the people of Tibet, I suppose, however, remaining in exile. But I'm not sure why the U.S. writing the bill in this way makes an impact there. But the U.S. took a stand on the Dalai Lama and reincarnation, and this was condemned by the people of China and praised by the exile government of Tibet. We have more money that I suppose is generally going to the U.S. propaganda narrative, particularly against China, and that is 3.3 million to Voice of America, which propaganda outlet. They report mostly stories that make the American government look good or other governments look bad, and then 4 million for Radio Free Asia, which is I believe just a subsidiary of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. The government of Cambodia will get $85.5 million if the U.S. agrees that it's helping to enforce sanctions on North Korea. One of the interesting parts of this bill is that there's a lot of bribery going on here. We tell the government of Cambodia, you want some money, you got to enforce these sanctions on North Korea. The other issue is that there's a lot of corruption that goes on too, and so Cambodia will probably spend a few $1 million hiring lobbyists to make sure that no matter what they decide to do, they're going to get that $85 million at least. There are at least $33 million going to democracy programs in Venezuela. So that's part of the regime change operation there. That $33 million will likely go to what they claim is the legitimate government. You just have some random dude running around Venezuela named Juan Guaido. At one point, he was the speaker of like the National Assembly or something like that, but he no longer even holds that position. He's not a popular figure. Most people in Venezuela, the vast majority of people in Venezuela, didn't know the guy's name when he proclaimed himself to be president. And yet the U.S. is spending a lot of money to bat this guy. And in the past, it's been shown that at least some of the money he's gotten from these international organizations has been squandered and stolen. And so here's, just millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars now flowing out of the country for a pointless regime change operation in Venezuela. When, if Venezuela is a more successful country that would do something to stem the flow of refugees, I'm sure it could help, border security in South America, would probably slow some drug trade. And then not to mention, if they're pumping more oil, energy is going to be cheaper. It sounds like it should be a win all the way for just, letting the Maduro government exist in Venezuela until there's a national, a natural opposition against him in the country, rather than punishing the country, impoverishing it, making it so that they can't pump as much oil, that they can't trade on the international market. Again, more destabilization on their borders, more general refugees in the region and, within the Americas are caused by this. And, the U.S. is spending money on this on top of it for a regime change operation that's never going to net anything. I mean, it's been several years now that Juan Guaido has been proclaiming himself to be president. It has only gone backwards in the amount of support that he really has and the chances he has of becoming president of that country. So throwing more bad money after bad money is what the U.S. government does, but it's just insane to see. Colombia, one of Venezuela's neighbors, will be getting $461 million. We support the government there. One of Biden's big things when he was president is the Plan Colombia initiative that I don't know a lot of details on, but I know it ends up with the U.S. spending an awful lot of money in Colombia, and a lot of that going to the coca eradication, stuff like that. One of the problems is that the Colombian government isn't Saudi Arabia, but they commit a lot of human rights abuses. And, there's been a long-term civil war there. And while that's over, there have been in recent years a lot of former members of that one, the group that de-armed, picked off and assassinated and stuff like that. And so there's, reason you want to just pile $500 million into the hands of the Colombian government, but that's what the U.S. is doing. Oh, but if they're not following the human rights conditions, we'll withhold 20%, which is insane. You would think that it would be 100 or nothing. We're not going to give a government money that's committing human rights abuses, but here we're actually committing to at least giving them 80%. $70 million will go to support internet freedom. Good luck figuring out exactly what that means. It's probably going to some NGO. That NGO or think tank could be like the Atlantic Council or something like that, and they'll write up a report saying that, North Korea doesn't allow internet, Assad does censorship, the Chinese do censorship, how terrible are they? It never once mentioned like the censorship that goes on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter and stuff like that. And then they'll get a big paycheck from the government. There's a specific $2.5 million that is going to surge internet freedom in closed societies. Again, I would guess this is going to target Russia, Iran, North Korea, stuff like that, and who knows with what kind of either maybe cyber operations they're talking about, or just writing more reports on how we could theoretically give North Koreans more internet or something like that. There's $75 million allocated to fight the war on drugs in the Caribbean Basin. This is the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. It was a Ronald Reagan thing, I believe. And so that's just more crazy spending that, who cares about the war on drugs anymore? Let's keep that $75 billion here. Zimbabwe gets targeted with essentially the U.S. has to now isolate them from international funds. I'm not really for other countries taking IMF funds or stuff like that, but if they want to do that, it's not on the U.S. to block different countries from being able to do that. And so I don't understand why this would be in the funding bill, what this has to do with funding at all. But yet it gets just thrown in here. No Americans will ever debate it or really know what's going on, but it'll have a huge impact on the lives of people in Zimbabwe and what, options the Zimbabwe government has. There's $15 million for democracy programs in South Sudan, another $60 million in assistance for South Sudan, and then $325 million to help integrate peacekeeping operations in the Congo. I kind of lumped all these together because I think the same general problem with all of them is the Ron Paul talking point on foreign aid, which is you're taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. And that's kind of what we've seen as the result of most of our interventions and attempts to distribute foreign aid, especially in African countries and countries where we don't have a whole lot of understanding of the culture. There's 453 million in assistance to Ukraine. I need to go through and try to get a better breakdown on this and figure out if any of this has to do with weapons, or if this is just money given directly to the government, or if they've gone back to the non-lethal aid. There's 290 million to counter Russia. This is, I guess, just going to, I guess it could go like cyber attacks. It could go to enforcing sanctions. It could go to think tanks that are going to write reports on how we could counter Russia. And so the U.S. government is going to fund Cold War thinking. And of course, then we're going to get a hell of a lot more of it. $173 million is being given to NATO, and $132 million is being given to Georgia. No, this isn't this, the state in the southeast, but rather the, country on Russia's southern border, which, just interesting that they're getting money and the state isn't. And I really do think those are powerful American first type arguments that I'm seeing against this bill a lot. And so I was pretty happy to see some of those kind of memes floating around. It says that this bill also sets another policy that the U.S. could not recognize Belarus being reabsorbed into Russia, and calls the current president of Belarus illegal. And it calls for to generate a list of high-ranking government officials and the assets of the president to attempt to sanction. And so again, this is a spending and relief bill. If anything, Congress should have been solely focused on where the money is coming from that, we want to redistribute, or, talk about, we're taking money from here or there. We got to increase taxes on people or whatever, where you're getting the money from and where, it's going, not setting policies that have to do with Eastern Europe. Again, nobody's even going to discuss that portion of this bill, and it could have a huge impact on U.S. foreign policy going forward. There's $6.1 billion in funding for foreign militaries. $3.3 billion of that is for Israel. I have a big question on this $500 million in funds for Israel. I can't figure out if that's in addition to the $3.3 billion, or if it's a portion of that $3.3 billion. In this article by Rubenstein and Sprague, they say it's additional. I sent out a tweet to Tulsi Gabbard, Rand Paul, Tom Massey, I think somebody else too, asking if anybody actually knew, or if it could be one or the other, and they're just not sure. But at least $3.3 billion going to Israel. This is a country that provides like universal health care and college to their population. And I'm not in support of having that in the U.S., but if they have that in another country, we probably don't need to give that country billions of dollars. And certainly a lot of that money just goes towards oppressing the Palestinians, trying to undermine the government in Syria, or, further provoking Iran. Then there's $1.3 billion going to Trump's favorite dictator, al-Sisi in Egypt. Really one of the most brutal regimes on the planet. And it has been for decades on end, and they've continued to receive this $1.3 billion going all the way back to the Camp David Accords. And I could tell you why this is the case. And I could tell you this because this is something that was happening when I was a part of the debate circuit in high school and college, when basically you would just read policy papers. And every policy paper said that if the U.S. revokes this aid, Egypt will go to war with Israel, and then we'll have World War III. And that was the most matter-of-fact thing. And so this $1.3 billion could never, ever be touched. And that's just what everyone knew. And so I'm guessing that's going to exist until people could, really start to challenge that narrative. But like I said, this was I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now that I was like in college and in high school on the debate circuit. And yeah, that was the absolute narrative of everyone. Every expert on the subject would say that if you cut the aid, they go to world, you have World War III. So you have to give $1.3 billion to Egypt every year forever. All right, some more foreign aid money. It's 241 million to Tunisia for security assistance, 1.5 million to Jordan security assistance, 250 million to Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, and Oman for border security. 710 million is allocated to fight the Islamic State through September 22nd, I believe, of 2022. So this is authorizing another year and a half of war against ISIS, a group that's largely defeated. And if the U.S. would leave, especially Syria, Assad, Iran, and Russia could secure the rest of the Syrian territory and eliminate any remaining pockets of the Islamic State or Al Qaeda in that country. However, that's being held up by the fact that the U.S. continues to try to hold on to a large portion of Syria. There's 40 million allocated for regime change policies in Syria, undermining the Assad government. Of course, that 710 million, a lot of that is essentially, Syrian regime change money as well, because if the U.S. is fighting ISIS in Syria, that means we're holding on to that territory and undermining Assad. The bill sets another policy that the Palestinian Authority will not be able to receive funds if it goes to the ICC. This is crazy that this is in the bill. Again, I'm not like a huge fan of the idea of an international court that can act as a world government and lock people up. But if the Palestinians are going to the international court and saying, can you investigate this laundry list of human rights abuses that have obviously been committed against them, the fact that is so offensive that they could then not receive funds goes to show how one-sided the U.S. policy is in Israel, and just how the one side the situation is. Because certainly anytime the Israelis want to demonize the Palestinians, there's absolutely no threat to their $3.3 billion. And then Congress commits $3 billion to fight in Afghanistan until September of 2022, which is stupid money because we could be out of there tomorrow. They should have allocated a few $1,000,000, maybe a few $100 million to fly the rest of the troops home and blow up the rest of the equipment there and call it a day. But that's not what Congress is going to do. All right, so I think that about covers what I had down as notes for what's in this bill. I mean, that was a lot of stuff. That's a lot of money going to foreign governments. So, as I mentioned a few times through all of that, I think the America First arguments are pretty popular and powerful right now. That we're in the middle of a pandemic. You could only come up with $600 checks for every American, and yeah, I just listed off hundreds of millions of dollars going to dozens of countries, sometimes billions of dollars going to these countries. They're just given from American taxpayers to them. The argument makes itself. Of course, if you're making the argument to somebody on the left, I think you just kind of drop the American First rhetoric, but you keep it relatively the same. Even with the Israel thing, you're like, you don't have universal health care in this country, but you do in Israel. Why are we giving them our money? Of course, they would probably just say, oh, tax Jeff Bezos, but still. Yeah, I think the only other thing I haven't noted is that Donald Trump is saying that he's going to veto this and demand $2,000 checks for every American, which, look, if you're going to spend $900 billion on bailouts, you should give $2,000 to every American versus $600 to every American. I guess I would say that if you're going to do it, it's probably best to just give everybody like an equal share of money or something like that. But that's not exactly what's gonna happen. But maybe Trump's plan's a little bit better than this one. If it gets vetoed too, it could give more time for debate and for people to go through the bill. And so maybe then we could argue to take out some particularly egregious things that's in there. Anyways, yeah, that's the huge amount of money that Congress authorized to spend. My concern with Trump's veto threat is that this was passed over. It's not even close to the margins needed. Need to over to that they can override that veto. So I don't think Trump's veto would be really meaningful there. All right, everybody, before I move on to the next story, I just want to take a quick second to thank the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. At palomaverdestore.com, you go and get your CBD products. If you're already a CBD user, you get your products at Paloma Verde because you know you're getting quality products with lab tested results, and you're getting consistent doses and everything like that. In the early days of CBD, it was quasi legal, so there's a lot of regulated and quality products out there. And CBD was inconsistent at times. You don't have that problem all with Paloma Verde. If you haven't used CBD in the past, but you have things like anxiety, back pain, just a lot of like feeling of dread or angst right now, go over to palomaverdestore.com and check out their education page and see how CBD could help you and which of their products could be most helpful to you. Carlos and his wife Vanessa run the company. If you have any questions, I'm sure you could send them an email. They've always been super responsive, super kind, and they know their product and they really believe in it, so they could explain to you how it could help you. And then use the promo code PEACE when you check out for a discount and to let them know that you came from the show. Let's get back to it. All right, the next article I have here is from Reason, and it is titled, Justin Amash introduces bill to end forever national emergencies. This is something that most people don't know about, but a lot of libertarians do, just because it's something that Ron Paul had brought up and talked about quite a bit. But today, Justin Amash unveiled the National Emergencies Reform Act, a bill to rein in presidential statutory control over emergency powers. Under current law, the executive office can invoke a national emergency to enact a policy that lawmakers might otherwise reject. Such a declaration can go on and on without an end in sight. The National Emergency Act currently holds that an emergency is only over when the president says it's over or Congress passes a veto-proof resolution. Of the 69 national emergencies declared since the NEE's inception in 1976, 35 are still ongoing. 7 originated with Trump, 10 with Obama, 11 with George W. Bush, 6 with Clinton, and 1 dating back to Jimmy Carter, which is crazy. Yeah, it has to be the 70s there that one of these national emergencies dates back from, which is, I'm 30 years old and longer than I've been alive, that you've had this national emergency ongoing. I don't know if there's any American that's anywhere near my age that feels like there's been a national emergency their entire life. I mean, Hurricane Katrina happened. There were, 9/11, stuff like that. There have been things that people would identify as national emergencies that have happened since I've been born, but certainly not a single one that has been ongoing for those 30 years. And yet apparently there's several that have been ongoing since I was a very young boy, and haven't stopped. And it gives the president these absurd powers that the president shouldn't have. Not optimistic that Justin Amash's bill is going to pass, but that doesn't mean that it can't add to the national conversation. Now more people know that there's a national emergency dating back to Jimmy Carter still in place, and it seems like if it was that important, Congress could either legislate it or it needs to go away. So some bad news here about our incoming president, and that is Biden's just a little bit crazy on this whole Russia thing. They're saying that the sanctions are that the response to the hack on the treasury, which is only claimed to be by Russia, evidence free. There's no real details or evidence for it, but yet they're saying that it was Russia that carried out this attack. Even the reports from FireEye and Microsoft just say it was an advanced attack. It doesn't say that Russia did it. And then whenever you read the articles, they do this thing where they say it has hallmarks of Russia and things like that. But that's so when it turns out not to be Russia, they could say, well, it did have the hallmarks. Um, Anyways, so Biden's chief of staff says it's going to go beyond sanctions, and Biden also attacked Trump for not responding. This is bad because when Biden takes office, he's going to have just a few weeks to save New START, and if he's launching some giant cyber attacks on Russia, I'm guessing that the lone nuclear weapons treaty between the U.S. and Russia is going to fall apart. The U.S., still has time to be provocative against China. I have this article here from Stars and Stripes. USS John McCain trains with French and Japanese navies in the Philippine Sea. This is, a commitment to defend the Philippines. It's provocative against China. It's, wrapping France and Japan in, anti-China maneuvers and stuff like that. We know that NATO is looking to take more of an anti-China position. And so, the Obama's pivot to Asia just continued and escalated all the way through the Trump administration. And a lot of the rhetoric coming so far out of the Biden administration or incoming administration makes it sound like they're going to continue a lot of those policies. In Israel, we are going to have elections coming in March. It sounds like Israeli politics in the past few weeks have been pretty wild with debate over whether or not they were going to have another round of elections, and it just came all the way, I guess, for sure that they're going to have it. The date is March 23rd. I'm not that up to date on Israeli politics that I could just look at the few names that are mentioned in these stories and know exactly what's going on. But it sounds like Netanyahu may be in a little bit of trouble. It sounds like a couple members of his coalition broke off, and that's actually why they're having this round of elections. I have a story here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com titled Israel and Gulf States went in on future U.S.-Iran talks. This is concerning to me because it sounds like a kind of a sneaky way to poison pill saving the Iran nuclear deal. If Israel is invited into the talks, my guess is Iran's going to be less likely to want to be in on the deal with Israel because Israel is known to have fabricated intelligence falsely claiming Iran had a nuclear weapons program in the past. So, Iran would say, well, Israel's obviously a disingenuous actor here, and we don't want them involved in the deal. And as well as, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain being pretty open adversaries and enemies of the Iranian government. Why extend this deal that works with the parties it works with to other parties unless you're just trying to insert a poison pill? And so I'm kind of worried that's going to be the outcome there. The last story I have for today, the U.S. implements more sanctions on Syria. The particular person I want to highlight here is the wife of Bashar al-Assad. And that's because this is a woman who spent a lot of time in European society. If you look at, there's a lot of pictures of her dressed like any other first lady in the West would be dressed. She is a survivor of breast cancer. She's fairly well spoken, and I believe very well liked by the Syrian people in general. She, first ladies in the U.S. historically have been fairly popular, and even if there's some people who have problems, with Michelle Obama or Barbara Bush or Eleanor Roosevelt or whoever, there's a lot of people who I think just by virtue of them being the first lady, hold them in high esteem. And so I think these are the kind of sanctions that are really going to backfire. I'm sure that it's not going to do a whole lot to help to destabilize the Syrian government. It's not going to do a whole lot to cause Assad to agree to, vacate power in Syria or to prevent him from taking over more of Syria. I think it could have the effect of really helping to, unify Syrian people against the United States and against these sanctions. One of the big things about sanctions is like if um, people with certain medical conditions tend to suffer. So her being a cancer survivor, she'll probably be able to speak out on that a little bit more. And it really looks bad. And I can't believe that they would go to these lengths, sanction a somewhat popular, first lady. And, yeah. And I believe her family too, some of who live in London, which again, goes to show that this is a woman who has spent a lot of time in the West and everything like that. If you're sanctioning this person, really, what is the policy about? Is it about punishment, or is it, about achieving what ends are? I don't know. Anyways, that's where I will wrap up the show for this week. No show on Friday. I will be back on Monday. Subscribe to the show at the YouTube page, Conflicts of Interest. Check out libertarianinstitute.org. I'm the news editor, write the daily news roundup, and post the show up there. You find both the show and the roundup on the homepage. Check out antiwar.com. I'm the assistant opinion editor there. And yeah, I think that's about it. Merry Christmas, everyone.